Okay, this is the presentation on the practice. And so a look at preliminary data, what's actually happening. And the whole idea is, hey, here's this theory of markets and how sanctioning costs are distributed. That was the first presentation, and basically it's a paper fragment. It's a long theoretical section, too long, that are associated with this. So we have the PDF of the paper, we have the previous discussion. Now I'm going to look at some preliminary data, and by data that I mean the plural of anecdotes, but this is what we got to look at right now. And so this is what was meant, and it's very preliminary, very, very tentative. I hope that's in line with expectations of this conference, of the summer session. If not, that's just what we got here. So, okay, just to rehash, in the key from a market point of view, looking at the underlying, economic model of a market with instantaneous communication, no transaction costs, blah, blah, blah. We have a situation where for an interruption in trade to have an effect on the target, the key condition is the amount originally traded, the QST, the amount traded between the sanction and target, has to be greater than the amount of that good produced in the rest of the world. And if that is the case, what we should observe is a change in trade flows, right, where the target exports to the rest of the world, the sanctioner imports from the rest of the world, and we have a drop in prices. And the quantity that the target exports and the sanctioner imports should go down, right? And so this is the market condition of basically economically effective sanctions that actually have an impact and don't just change trade patterns. In that case, just recall, even though we have that QST greater or less than rho, right? The impacts of the sanctions are going to be part of this ratio, this QST over Q rho, right? The amount of trade between the sanctioner and the target divided by the amount that's produced in the rest of the world. And the fundamental insight, and it might be minor, but that comes out of the model, is that rho is the denominator. The rest of the world is so important in all of this. And so the key thing is, a lot of times people look at just how much trade there is between the sanction and target, and it's like, look, you got to, it'll be divided by, I don't know, the GNP or, but it's the rest of the world that's important. Okay. Meanwhile, in the real world, the theoretical model is just that, right? It's a perfect, I often liken it to a frictionless plane in physics, right? Well, there's no such thing as a frictionless plane. And so in the real world, we have transaction costs. Transaction costs are, and I think that it's going to turn out, I think that that's going to be the big thing to look at going forward. Also, we have disruption costs. There are costs associated not just with sanctioning, but very often the situation that underlies the sanction. There's a reason someone's sanctioning, right? And it may not always be something that causes economic disruption, but in the case of a war, it absolutely is. And there are also behavioral market reactions to just the threat of sanctioning, which is, not in these rational choice models, very behavioral. And these are things that, in fact, kind of frustrate looking at the situation here, because we don't know, right? It's very often difficult to tease out the effects of sanctioning from the effects of disruption that comes from whatever the underlying crisis is. So the thing about these is they're both temporary and upfront, right? And so they kind of front load the cost profile. And this paper is not dealing with the second game, the question of whether or not imposing the sanction has an effect on the target, the political game, the coercion game. This is just about, hey, are these things creating costs? And however, the profile can be important, right? Because if costs go down in the future, that tends to be associated with going forward, the conflict continuing. And in contrast, fundamental market costs are enduring, right? And so if the costs that are identified in this market model, three nation market model that I've been using, they are the enduring costs. They're going to keep going. Not necessarily increase, but they can increase if you increase the coalition and that sort of thing. So the fundamental market costs are enduring. And so that's part of what we need to be looking at in the real world. Now, to look at some observations, I'm not going to call them data, from the real world. Okay, Russian oil exports to Europe and versus to Europe and the U.S. versus to row, right? But we got mainly Europe, and Europe is the lion's share of these things. The U.S. does not import a lot of Russian oil, and so the devil here is of course the data, right? What do we got? And it's recent data, and very often data is a year isn't data. It is, the estimates don't get tallied up till a year later, and so everything before that is a guess. And looking at IEA data from November 2021, IEA produced, it said, okay, let's take a snapshot 2021 when looking at this specific question. And so we do have some information about Europe, but we don't have row, right? This is the big problem in things. But we can say that on the top line here, total US and Europe, and that's OECD Europe, right? Their imports of total oil were 5118, about 5,000. This is thousands. Everything, I try to have everything here be thousands barrels per day. So that's 5 million barrels per day. And finished products, gasoline, not crude and not feedstocks. The finished products are 14.9, right? So that's gives you the scale there. Now, so what's that mean? Well, if we divide it by the data the best data in that same data set, the total OECD imports, right, around the world, we see that the market share that, it's a fairly substantial market share. It's about a fifth to, just between a fifth and a third. Just to come, and why be more precise on data that's wonky, right, or questionable? But so there is, from that point of view, if we compare the, QST is that first line, right, and Q row here, it's approximately Q row, but it's not really, right, because Q row is much bigger. There's a lot of other oil in the world, and that's the bottom line. If I go and I get a report, and I do not have the tab there, but if we go to the BP World Stats thing, we get 2020 data, and the BP's energy review tells us that the world has 65 million barrels a day, right? That's the world trade. Now, that's not total production, but that's the amount of oil that's traded between nations, right? And so, again, not exactly Q-row, but it's at least the stuff that crosses a border, right? And because not some oil is just used locally and that sort of thing. So total oil imports, and here we see Russia at 8%. So not really a big market share, right? It's big, but there's a lot of oil produced. And so the point is, the question then becomes, all right, what about our fundamental question? If you look at this and you say, if you get a number like 21%, theoretically it has to be 50% or more, right, in order to have a market effect. But we know that doesn't translate. 20%, okay. 8%, could you replace 8%? Well, let's take a look at what happens. Okay, so, and this is really preliminary. This is newspaper comments, and I've got from New York Times, CNBC, Nikkei Asia. It's vague, right? But what appears to have happened, and well, it's vague, but it's also obvious because there are plenty of news reports that India and China are buying more Russian oil. And New York Times reports that India went from 33,000 barrels per day, although actually technically in January they had zero imports from Russia. But in the previous year, in 2021, they averaged about 33,000 barrels per day. And that went up to 700,000 as recent as April. And who knows, it could be going higher. But that's the gain. Meanwhile, China gets a lot through pipelines, and so it's not clear whether or not that pipeline trade has increased or not. There are government contracts, and perhaps you assume these things are running at something like capacity. So, however, their shipborne trade has increased, and it's gone from 800,000 barrels a day to 1.1 million, and that is a net gain of 967,000 barrels, just a little less than a million barrels per day. Of course, if we recall back, if we go back, it was over 5 million barrels a day that was at stake with Europe, right? So 1/5, right? This is about 1/5 the volume that could be at play if it was totally sanctioned, right? This is about 1/5 that volume. So significant, but not a lot. And meanwhile, the word cheap keeps coming up. They're buying cheap oil. They're buying cheap oil. Well, try to find out what that means. New York Times has an estimate that 30, maybe 35. These things are wonky. So $30 less. And the Nikkei Asia reports, though, that one problem from the sanctioners' point of view is that the price of oil has gone up from one year to the next. So the volumes, are we would expect higher volumes everywhere, and more importantly, that Russian oil revenue has not gone down, right? That Russian oil revenue has stayed. And here's another complication, right? The world market price changed. And you could say Putin picked his time well when oil prices were high. And so if he has to sell if he has to sell $30 less in a perfect rational choice model, opportunity costs are the same as costs, right? So, sure, you're $30 or less, the price has gone up so much that you're practically getting the same amount. You're getting basically the same amount of revenue in, yet, and in a rational choice model, hey, you're not earning. You could have earned another $30, and that is supposed to have an effect. The question is, behaviorally or just in normal psychology, is that the case, right? Or as a practical matter, not forget psychology, but if you still have the same revenue coming in, you're still employing people. So politically, that constancy of revenue might be the point, right? And so these are the kinds of things that are plaguing this analysis here. However, the thing that from a theoretical point of view is interesting is, having just said that, hey, the market share looked kind of low. We got it down to 8%, and by looking at row, which is what you're theoretically supposed to do. But what we're seeing is almost textbook. I mean, it just actually, just the whole India buying cheap oil and refining and then selling diesel to Europe, right? That's what a lot of their India's diesel exports to Europe have gone up because they're selling the product that Europe isn't getting from Russia. And so it's textbook, right? And the lower price, and India's making out like a bandit on this. That's exactly what the model predicts. So, that here we have a case where we can really observe these conditions with oil, and it appears that even that we are seeing that effect, that 8% is enough apparently. Okay, now to look at natural gas. And natural gas is, just in general, and when I was doing this paper, this was the idea. I said, oil moves around a lot. Oil's easy to, you can put it on a ship, and sure, there are pipelines, and that is complicating things, right? And but natural gas really wants to move by pipeline, and So it seemed to me right off the bat that the transaction costs in changing natural gas would be higher. And so that kind of motivated the whole paper or poster proposal to, hey, let's look at this. Um, so what I got here is I got, the QST, right? The quantity between the sanction and target is Russian natural gas exports to EU and UK, which IEA, there they got I think the right number. And Russia was sending, they've actually been decreasing their amounts in some ways. And the EU has, in fact, has been moving in a direction away from dependence there. But it's 158 billion cubic meters, right, that they got in 2021 from Russia. So in comparison, world natural gas production is 4,000 billion, right? It's 4 trillion. And that volume, if we look at it here, the chart I think I can lay it out better. I've only got one thing I'm looking at, natural gas. But it's 4%, right? This is the QST divided by rho figure. That ratio is 4%. And by the way, I have 3 different measures of rho here, right? I have 3 ways of conceiving rho. So the first is to say, okay, what's production? Then, and this is more equivalent to what I did with the oil, said, well, let's not just look at production. Let's look at world natural gas exports. And when we go to exports, things that cross borders, well, only about 1 trillion billion or 1 trillion cubic meters cross borders. So now Russian exports to EU are 16% of that. All right, much more decent market share. The thing about it is, though, natural gas wants to go in a pipeline. In order, there isn't as much shipborne trade in it, right? It's much more pipeline dependent. There is, however, a shipborne trade, and that's with liquefied natural gas. And if we look at that has been a growing market, and sending stuff by ship tends to be expensive, but that's been growing. And globally in 2020, where it's finding data on that, you had to go to Statista, had to go to kind of private, not the governmental IGOs here, or NGOs, whatever we got there. 488 billion, right? And so Russian exports to Europe, right, are 32% of that. And what's interesting is that's a lot. Seems like a lot. And you're going to have to take away, from this natural gas, if you want to ship stuff around on the limited number of ships and that are out there and that are doing this trade, you're going to have to divert 32% of that. And what I think complicates this is, it's not clear that, where other folks get that stuff, right? If you're getting natural gas via ship, it's not clear that you could get it from a pipeline, right? That the alternatives are there. So I think we have much greater competition here. And I have a note at the bottom to remind myself to say this. This growth, right, 158 billion cubic meters, that is about 6 years of growth in that trade. Now, some years are bigger than others, so it might, in the bigger years, it might be equivalent to just maybe 3, but this amount, 158, right? If you wanted to add that in the past, it's taken about 6 years to get through just the evolution of the market to that level. And so that kind of looks like this is much more of a big deal, right? That this was my initial impression going in. And it was largely borne out by looking at this ex ante data. However, what's been happening is a little more questionable. And here, preliminary observations, I really don't have a lot of data because it's very questionable, right? Who is actually sanctioning? And the EU has sanctioned, there's been more sanctioning of oil out there than there has been of gas. And so the situation is very uncertain, right? EU's been reluctant. Hungary flat out says, no, I'm not doing that. And there are certain countries that are just pipeline dependent. And so we've seen that reluctance. Now that makes sense theoretically, right? That, sanctions on natural gas should be more painful, right? We're seeing a big market share there. And if a small market share in oil had the impact that we're seeing, we should see, a lot more of an impact. So the sanctioner is much more reluctant to actually put the sanction on. Indeed, Russia has largely, much of the change in gas has been through Russia either demanding payment in rubles or and usually when they've cut people off, it's because they haven't done that. But essentially, Russia has counter-sanctioned on this point, which, okay, one wonders what, there's a logic there. The counter-sanctioning, though, should be painful to Russia, too. But it could be an artifact of, the situation is complicated because the financial sanctions are acting also as a indirect, sanction on these things. So our observations here are tenuous, I think, to a certain extent, and yet this is what we've got, right? The natural gas should be very painful, and we are seeing that reluctance, but we'll have to. And the data right now is also complicated by the fact that countries have reserves of natural gas and they don't use as much in the summer, right? And so we have seasonal issues that are complicating things. So, but these really should be the more painful ones. They will be and it is kind of common that, or frustratingly sensible that the actual things that would hurt the sanctioners are reluctant to do, right? And so we're going to have to see how that plays out and analyze why is Russia willing to counter sanction when they aren't. And it could be, like I say, complicated by the financial situation. So just to conclude here, what have I got out of this? I've taken 22 minutes of your time now. I think transaction costs and cost profile, right? When we put these things together, this is what's important because not modeling the game, the overall game here. Nevertheless, if we look at like just the standard model of war of attrition, they have in Fudenberg and Tyrrell in the textbooks for game theory, they talk about situations of eventual continuation or eventual stopping, and the cost profile over time drives that. And so the question is, how enduring are these things? How long does if there is in fact a premium, right, that India is getting a deep discount and the volumes stay low, right, does that stick around? And is that something, that's an important thing to look at from that game point of view, but also paying the transaction costs, right? Our nations with the natural gas, right? We can really see, hey, you got to have LNG terminals, you got to have LNG ships, and are you able to pay that cost? And is Europe going to be able to, where's the cost profile there in that, can Europe pay the costs and get to a point where, yeah, we're good. We paid this upfront cost. Now we're good. We'll just keep sanctioning you. While Russia still pays a price. That is that cost profile is important for the overarching game of coercion. So that's something to look at perhaps more directly. Financial and trade sanctions. This is strictly a trade sanction situation, that model, right? Just looking at trade. And this goes back in sanctioning to, the British with their blockades had the Admiralty approach, which focused on trade, and the Treasury approach, which focused on foreign exchange and reserves. And so teasing out the impacts there are, I think, going to be important for understanding what we're doing here. And those things may have more of an impact, right, on Russia. And certainly it's the ruble sales are complicating things. But overall, too, the problem of neutrality. This has always been an issue with sanctioning. And if we go back and look at kind of the League of Nations, and Nicholas Mulder has a very good book on the economic weapon, where he looks at the history of sanctioning through World War, early sanctioning, World War One, League of Nations, up through World War Two. The problem of neutrality has always been there, and it was, the U.S. was not being part of the world, of the League of Nations, was a problem mainly because if they ever sanctioned anyone, the U.S. was going to show up and sell to the target. And what do you do about it? And the British, driven by Royal Navy concerns, said, under no circumstances are we going to stop U.S. shipping. That leads to a war with the one Navy that we really don't think we can take. And so, or not easily, but that drove things. And in the case of the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, there's a direct or interesting comparison that Italy needed about 8,000 tons or whatever. It was 8,000 units a day of oil. And the league, when sanctioning Italy, said, hey, we could cut them off from that, and that would stop them in their tracks. But here's the U.S., and the U.S. Was not playing sanctioning games. We had laws against doing it, actually, in the Neutrality Act. And so they had this problem of how do we stop oil? And Roosevelt was like, well, we could have a moral sanction. I could approach the major oil manufacturers and, okay, maybe we could stop things. But the problem was 8,000 tons or whatever, barrels or whatever that number was not big. And even if Roosevelt got the big oil manufacturers to say, no, we won't sell to Italy, according to Mulder in his book, the capacity of the minor U.S. producers was about 80,000, right? It was 10 times the volume that Italy would need. And they're like, look, those guys will provide it, even if we get them to it. And now that's a case where the amount of oil, it was important to Italy, but the amount of oil versus the rest of the world was very small, right? Russia is much bigger player than this. But that goes to that problem of neutrality, right? The rest of the world is important, and we are definitely seeing that play out with India is really as a oil importer and a refining state. They're important. However, the rest of Asia is being important, and China is playing quiet. But so we have India and China in the role of the U.S. during the League of Nations, and also that problem of neutrality. How do you deal with that? Are you going to have secondary sanctions? And of course, Lisa Martin wrote a book on coercive cooperation. How do you get people into your sanctioning coalition? But that is going to play out and be, I think, an interesting aspect of this to look at. So going forward, definitely need to get better data, and probably for oil, try to find the shipborne versus pipeline-driven stuff, because we have that for the other stuff, for the NG versus LNG. The harder data to get, and keeping track of that, I think, is going to be interesting going forward. So, okay, I've taken half an hour of your life. I hope there was something in there that you found useful. It's certainly, this summer session has been useful to make me get to work, and because it's kind of discouraging to go through these preliminary data and not be able to find things. But so I hope there's been some value. I've enjoyed it, and I hope everyone has a good summer.